Thank you, everyone, for coming and hanging out with us today in general government. I'm going to call this meeting to order. I guess because Senator Murdock did not bring breakfast for everyone, we'll go ahead and get started with the interim study. So, Senator, I'm just going to hand it over to you and let you lead the way. So.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I apologize for not having breakfast. My full intention was to go buy donuts and have donuts for everyone, but the cold weather, my car would not start this morning. So we can blame Senator Coleman for not picking me up early enough to get donuts for everyone. And is that not a typical political answer? Blame someone else? But thank you, and I appreciate you, Madam Chairman, for hearing this study. This has been on our horizon for several years. The plans and the implications of this has been coming towards us for a long time, and I appreciate the speakers coming to tell us a little bit about what's been going on and what we can kind of do as a state to push back on for lack of a better term, it's a land grab. That's what it is. And I just want to, before I have the speaker start, I just want to make one comment. And that comment is the United States of America became great because of private property ownership. And that is what we strive for. That is part of our freedoms. That is part of our drive, is private property ownership. And with that, I would like to introduce the first speaker, and it's Margaret Byfield. She's the Executive Director of American Stewards of Liberty. And Margaret, you are recognized with the chairman's permission.
Thank you all. Thank you. Okay, is that better? All right, great. Thank you. And thank you, Senator Murdock. It was really a pleasure to get the invitation to come in. This is such an important topic, and you really nailed it when you said how important property rights are. And so I had a Lyft ride over here this morning, and my driver was from Jamaica. And he said, so what are you doing? And so I told him, and I just started, you don't ask me that question because you get a lecture on property rights, right? And so, I talked about how important property, that's what made America free. That's why everybody wants to come here, because the people own the land, not government. And we had this conversation. He goes, wow. He said, so I left Jamaica 4 years ago. The government owns everything. And we didn't have freedom, which is why he's here. And so that's why it's so important. I mean, people in other nations treasure what we have. And yet we are allowing our federal government to really erode that very essential right, which then erodes our liberties. So let me go ahead and dive in. I want to just give kind of a brief overview of 30 by 30, and I'm happy to take any questions if I'm really planning to do more of the cliff notes, so if you guys want to do a deeper dive on this, please ask me questions. No, but I also want to get to the next level in this fight. There's another whole issue that is developed out of 30 by 30, which is really the purpose of 30 by 30, that very, very few people are even aware of, and it's moving very fast. So we talked about this at the summit, where we laid out this concept of natural asset companies that they are trying to create and what that means. And now the SEC has published a proposed rule to authorize these. So we're now not at this is what they're planning to do. We're now at this is what they are doing. So I'm going to touch on both of those issues, and please feel free to ask questions. So to begin with, we'll just start at the beginning. I think I'm pushing the right button. I'm not getting anything. Well, I'll go ahead and start in. So 30 by 30 In a nutshell, what is 30 by 30? 30 by 30 is an international agenda to permanently protect 30% of the world's land and oceans by 2030. So the first thing to understand is it's an international agenda, and it has been implemented in nations all across the world. If you've tracked what's going on in the Netherlands with the farmers and ranchers, and the Netherlands has now required 2,000 to 3,000 landowners to voluntarily sell their land to the government because they are producing too many putting too much nitrogen in the soil. What the Netherlands did is they signed up under a program called Natura 2000. And Natura 2000 is something the European Union has adopted. It's been implemented for over 20 years. And they are now at the place where they began. If you go to the Natura 2000 website, you can read how they talk about their program. And then if you go to the Biden's 30 by 30 material, you will see it's the same language, the same promises, all of the same. So what we're looking at is if 30 by 30 is implemented in America the way that President Biden is seeking for this to be done, we're going to be looking like the Netherlands pretty quickly, where people are going to lose their property rights. So 30 by 30, it really began 6 days after the presidency began, on January 27, 2021, in the big climate crisis executive order that most people are familiar with because that's where it shut down a lot of oil and gas development and put in a lot of renewable requirements. And tucked in Section 216 was this very, nicely worded statement that said that they had the goal to achieve conserving at least 30% of our lands and waters by 2030. First thing to note here is at least 30%. In their follow-up material and a lot of the statements from executives in the White House, they have said, and confirmed secretaries, they have said 30 by 30 is the first step. What we're really seeking is 50 by 50. And you can Google this. It's known as the Half-Earth Agenda, and it's the next level up that they are trying to seek. 30 by 30 is just the beginning. So you have to understand that that's the administration's perspective as they're pushing through different programs. So I want to break this down a little bit. The purpose for 30 by 30, what is their basis for doing this? They say we're in a climate crisis. And in order to stave off that climate crisis, we need to permanently set aside 30% of our lands and oceans so that we save wildlife and species, and therefore we save humanity. So everything is based on this notion of the climate crisis. Well, what is the climate crisis science based on? Projections. It is not based on facts, historical facts. The projections where they come out and they say we're going to lose 1 million species in the coming decades worldwide if we don't do this, and over 2/3 of America's species if we don't do this, that is not based on sound science and factual data. That is a bunch of guesses being put into a model to then project it out 20, 50 years from now and come out with this conclusion that we're going to lose 1 million species. So any real good scientist knows modeling can be very helpful to help you kind of figure out what questions you should be asking and what areas you should be digging into, but no real scientist is going to rely on the outcome of a model, but that is what they are relying on. And so I want to just break down a few of these, a few things that I think are important to understand. They say we're in a climate crisis. They say we're losing habitat, natural habitat, to development. So this chart is important because this is actually the only data set, most recent data set of our land composition in America. And you can see that most of it's in forest, crops, shrubs. The developed land in America is the red bar at the top. It's 5.3% of America is what's considered developed. The other thing, if you notice that there's no change in the level of red, That's because it's statistically insignificant, the change in developed land in America. Now, this is actual facts. This is data from the USGS. It's a report that was put together by Rob Gordon, which, Senator, you probably remember him speaking at the summit. So this is important to understand. We are not in a crisis of developed land being converted to natural lands. I think the public can get misinformed by this when they say that we are, because if you live in a city like I live right now in the city that, for my size of city, is the fastest growing city in the nation. So everywhere I look, I see developed land converting natural land. But there's other places where the opposite is true, and on balance, there's no change. The other thing that I think is really important to understand is the developed land is 5.3% of America's land base. But half of this is what they consider open space. So it's our city parks, our golf courses, our really large lots, the open areas for flood control. You know what I'm talking about, all of those areas. So what we're really talking about as far as developed land, in other words, where we live, where we have our homes, where we go to school, our grocery stores, where we work, our churches, our hospitals, our sanitation facilities, all of that makes up about 2.5% of America's land base. So we're not in a crisis. So one of the figures they give us, the president's team gave us when they implemented 30 by 30, is they said that currently in 2021, 12% of the land is permanently protected in America. So that first thing that tells you this isn't about ownership, because the federal government owns 30% of our land, give or take. I'd like to give you a real figure on that, but the federal government, all the agencies disagree on how much land they actually own. So I rounded up to about 30%. Total in America, federal, state, and local owns 40% of our land, which leaves only 60% of the land in private hands today. That's a bit concerning. So the 12% they say is permanently protected. So we know what's in that figure because that's a figure that comes from the USGS. And what's included in that land are your national parks, wilderness areas, permanent conservation easements on private lands, state parks, national wildlife refuges, national monuments, and other protected areas. One thing that you will note about all of these areas, they are highly, highly protected. If there is any resource development on it, it is very restricted. And all of these areas take permission for the people to enter. So that's another thing that I think is important for people in the recreational community to understand, that we put 30% of our nation in it. There's already battles that our recreational community fights on just keeping access to what's already protected. All of these areas take permission. You have to have permission by the federal government in order to enter or use these lands. So that's the 12%. So we know what's in that. I'm going to skip over this. So we know what's in that. Now, the other thing I think is really interesting, so when we're talking about the amount of land that they're talking about, 12% equals about 300 million acres in America. So to get the other 18% that they're seeking by 2030, we're talking about another 400 million acres. That's a lot of land. Now, one of the figures that they give us, and you'll see this in all the material, you'll see this in the Department of Interior's fact sheet that they came out the day that that executive order was implemented, when they talked about what they would be doing to implement 30 by 30. They give this figure, and you'll see this in all the environmental literature too. They say we are losing a football field worth of habitat every 30 seconds in America. Okay, that's the sensationalism. That's to scare the public. All right, well, so let's break it down. That's 3,000 acres a day. That's 1.1 million acres a year and 11 million acres in 10 years. Okay, that is their math. That is what they say the problem is, that according to them, we may lose 11 million acres in 10 years. So that just raises the question, why are they seeking to permanently protect 400 million acres in 9 short years if the problem, as they define it, is 11 million acres potentially that would be lost. This isn't about conservation or restoration. This is absolutely about political control of our lands. I thought this was kind of interesting. So this is the map that the National Geographic published in 2019. National Geographic is one of the environmental groups that's been pushing this 30 by 30 agenda worldwide. And they show what the current 12% looks like to scale. If you were to put all of our protected lands together, that's a lot of land that's already set off for very, very little productive use, if any at all. And their goal is the 30%. So then Governor Ricketts, I think, said this the best at the time when this first came out, and he said that this is the equivalent of protecting one state of Nebraska every year for the next 9 years, or 2 states of Texas. Thankfully, he's now Senator Ricketts, and we're relying on him back in D.C. now as well. I thought it was interesting, that 5.3% of developed land, I took a real guess and I made a blue box thinking that would look to me about like 5.3% compared to the 12%. I just thought it was kind of interesting to put that up there to see what we're talking about that's developed land. All right, so how did the administration respond? We put together a pretty good grassroots campaign and were able to label this a land grab in the media. The media picked that up, and it became really the national story, was the 30 by 30 was a land grab. And so by May of 2021, the government, the Biden administration finally released their first report, which was the one we were waiting for. It was supposed to tell us how they were going to implement this agenda. So instead of us reading tea leaves and reading what the environmentalists were saying, reading what they were saying, this was going to come out and confirm yes or no what this was going to be. Well, it was kind of a letdown because it really didn't provide a lot of useful information. But here is what it did do. First off, the first thing they did is they changed the name of the program. So we no longer call it 30 by 30, we now call it America the Beautiful. That is meant to, of course, make it sound very good and appealing to an uninformed public. They also said it's not about protecting the land. This is about conserving and restoring the land. But then they decide not to define what they mean by conservation. They say, that can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. Now, you guys write legislation. You know how important it is to define the terms. Because if you don't define the terms, somebody is going to subjectively interpret those down the road to their benefit, their political bend. So it's really important as legislators that you guys make it very clear by defining the terms as to what you intended through the legislation. Well, the Biden administration knows that too. They're just not doing it. The other thing that it did is it fails to identify which lands qualify. So we now know, what's in the 12%. They didn't want to be pinned down by that, so of course they didn't address that question. So why do they need to control so much land? That's really the question. Because if you really look at 30 by 30, it's not about conservation. It is about getting control over the use of our land. And really, it's a question of who's going to use our resources. Not whether we're going to use our resources, but who's going to be benefiting and profiting from those resources. That's really what 30 by 30 is about. So alongside of 30 by 30, we picked up a story in September of 2021. And this was a story written by an investigative reporter. There were a couple that came out, but the investigative reporter, Whitney Webb, who, if you know any of her work, she's done some pretty incredible stuff. She wrote this story, and this is where we picked it up. But then the New York Stock Exchange is partnering with the Intrinsic Exchange Group to create what are called natural asset companies. Now, these natural asset companies are going to be investment vehicles where natural assets are the base, the purpose for the investment device, in order for people to buy stocks in and gain an investment profit. Well, who's behind this? Well, first, let me address what this really looks like. So when you think about a traditional company or a traditional investment type vehicle, and you think of putting land, water, those kind of assets in it, right? Conservation easements in perpetuity, that easement is a distinct property right that can be enrolled in these natural asset companies. They're doing something very unique. They have decided that we have missed out on quantifying and monetizing and valuing the most important parts of nature. And that if we do put a value on them, then we can better protect nature. So what are we talking about? We're talking about intrinsic values, the natural processes that nobody has a right to own, like clean air. This is one of these things that's kind of hard. When I first read this article, I kind of stepped back and went, wait a minute, this is really crazy. We were knee deep in the 30 by 30 issue, and, I dug into it and I thought, this doesn't even sound plausible when I first read it. But I kept my eye on it because having tracked the environmental groups for 30 years, I know that a lot of things that they say that I don't think could ever be done, they tend to get done. So what they're talking about is they're talking about putting a dollar value on natural processes. So think about, we're used to putting a dollar value on land, water, the product that comes off of that, whether it be a crop or livestock or timber. That's how our market works. That's the supply and demand. That's the actual tangible object that is sellable, and that creates our market. Well, they are literally talking about putting an arbitrary figure on the natural processes. So they're saying that you put the seed in the soil and the water makes it grow and it sprouts up and it takes the carbon dioxide and it grows bigger. Well, nobody has put a value on that, and we are missing out by doing that. That process, that natural process, is what they are saying they're going to put a value on that becomes an asset in these natural asset companies. It is literally being arbitrarily made up. Now, let me tell you, they are doing this in other nations. They are doing this in other nations. So when they take this and they put a value on these natural processes, you can see up there, this comes from the Intrinsic Exchange Group's website. And when they do this, then it changes the size of the natural asset economy that they think we will have. So our traditional economy today, they value at $1,540 trillion. But once you add in and you value all these natural processes, then it becomes a $5,000 trillion economy. If you're saying this sounds absolutely crazy, then that just tells me you have sane common sense, because it is absolutely crazy. We have really dubbed this as a Ponzi scheme, and we don't believe it's going to work. But that's not the purpose for it. What it needs to accomplish is a transfer of the assets. Who's going to invest in these companies? It's going to be the wealthy elite, the BlackRocks, the foreign adversaries like China. This is the way that they can get control of our assets without really the American people even having a say in this whole process. Who's behind it? Well, the key funder of this that started the Intrinsic Exchange Group is the Rockefeller Foundation. And this is also off their website. This is who they say supports this agenda. So you have all of the usual people who are behind the climate crisis agenda. The same people who are saying we are in a climate crisis, the same people who are saying we must protect 30% of the world's lands and oceans, are the same people that are lining up to profit through these natural asset companies from all these protected lands. It's really, in some ways, kind of brilliant if it weren't so scary. Okay, so one of the key things that had to happen is the Biden administration basically has to legitimize this. So they put out a national strategy to develop statistics for environmental and economic decisions. They put out their first publication on this, where they ran it out for public comment, was back in, I think, September of 2022. And then they finalized this report in January 31st of 2023 of this year. And here is where they go through and they explain how they're going to go out and quantify all of these natural processes that we've been missing for the purpose of putting it on the balance sheet, the federal balance sheet, and I think also for collateral. So they want to increase the national debt. And when we sat down with Senator Ricketts on this back in April and briefed him on it because we wanted to get some key members aware that this was coming. So when it moved, we had some key members that could act quickly. And so when we had this conversation with the senator, he said, this is to increase the national debt. They need to put more collateral on the federal balance sheet so they can increase the national debt. Yeah, that makes sense, doesn't it? I think the other thing is that it's another vehicle to tax the American people. I think that's coming. So this is how they describe it, though. It's a strategy for producing natural capital accounts that work within the U.S. standard national accounting system. These natural capital accounts would be able to measure the economic value that natural assets provide to society. Okay, the next thing that happened, which is what we have been focused on since literally about September 27th when we got the pre-publication notice. The only reason that the New York Stock Exchange and IEG came public back in September of 2021, that this is what they were planning to do, I believe, is because they had to make a request of the Security Exchange Commission for unique listing requirements in order to be able to list these very unique natural asset companies on the New York Stock Exchange. So they had to go public. I think that's the only reason we even found out about it. But they have been waiting since then for Security Exchange Commission to authorize this so that they can be legitimately listed on the New York Stock Exchange. So October 4th, the proposed rule was published in the Federal Register. The SEC is approving the listing of these natural asset companies on the New York Stock Exchange. And they only allowed 21 days for public comment. And there was no press release, no press at all on this. There was only one publication that picked up this notice and did a little report on it. Thankfully, we did see it on September 27th when the pre-publication came out. And so we got busy. We put a good legal team together who got us comments and got comments from other partners so that we have standing so that if we need to sue to try and stop this, we're in a position to try and stop this. But we have a really good legal team that's been working on that for us. So I can kind of drill into this a little bit deeper and show you some of the language, but let me just break and make sure, Senator, do you want me to keep going into this or do you want me to stop? And I'm concerned about time. I just don't want to crowd into your time.
I have a question, Senator. You showed the graph that had the percentage breakdown of U.S. lands, what's developed, what's nationally protected. Do you have some sort of national graph that demonstrates what percentage of the whole entire globe has been developed?
I don't.
Okay.
I haven't seen that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to walk you through some of the language because I think it's really important to see what is actually in the SEC notice. So here's how they describe what a natural asset company is. A NAC is a corporation whose primary purpose is to actively manage, maintain, restore as applicable, and grow the value of the natural assets in their production of ecosystem services. Okay, one of the first things you have to understand is that this is not like a traditional investment company. Instead of investing in something like a business, which you know has a product and is going to have an investment return, this flips that on its head because they're doing the opposite. They're investing in something to protect it that doesn't have a commodity coming off of it. Like a traditional commodity, like if it's a forest, you would think it's the timber, that creates the construction material. Their purpose is to protect it. So we're not going to see those kind of products coming off these lands, which then raises the question, how are they going to create an investment return on this? Which is a really good question. And they say NACs will be corporations that hold the right to the ecological performance, i.e. the value of natural assets and production of ecosystem services. Ecosystem services, that definition incorporates the natural processes. So when you see ecosystem services, part of that is that new value that they're putting on. Produced by natural and working areas such as national reserves or large-scale farmlands, and have the authority to manage the areas for conservation, restoration, or sustainable management. So everything has to be managed for sustainable management. These rights can be licensed like other rights, including run with the land rights, such as mineral rights, water rights, or air rights. And NACs are expected to license these rights from sovereign nations or private landowners. Now, Exhibit 3 of the SEC rule is what it is, the Intrinsic Exchange Group's framework. So this is like the really big document where Intrinsic Exchange explains how you put a company together, you know, what assets can be included, how you monetize these natural processes, and then how they're going to ensure the accounting, that this is all legitimate and the accounting is done correctly. So that it's a real interesting document. But in it, they say, these assets can be areas that are publicly owned, such as national parks or tracts of privately owned property held by individuals or corporations. So first question, how does the SEC have the approval to authorize the listing of our federal lands as an asset for a private investment company for private profit? From the world elites, like Bill Gates, BlackRock, China, as I mentioned before. They don't have that authority to do that, but they're doing it. In the New York Stock Exchange, so they have to create new manual language so that this can be listed on the New York Stock Exchange that goes into the New York Stock Exchange manual. And this comes out of that new language that they will be doing. Ecological performance right means the rights of the value of natural assets and the production of ecosystem services in a designated area, including the authority to manage the area. These rights are granted to NACs from a natural asset owner as provided through a license agreement. Okay, so second question. How does the SEC have the authority to give the natural asset company management authority over our federal lands? Exactly. Natural asset companies, together IEG and the New York Stock Exchange, will enable investors to access nature's store of wealth and transform our industrial economy into one that is more equitable. So that's the other thing to understand. This is about a societal transformation, trying to change us from an industrial economy to one that they deem is sustainable. Okay, there's 3 types of land that can make up a natural asset company, and they break it down into natural, protected, or natural, working, and hybrid. And so under the natural areas, what they're talking about is these are our protected lands. So this would be our national parks, state parks could go in these. Anything that would fall under the 30 by 30 permanently protected. So a transformational solution whereby natural ecosystems are not simply a cost to manage, but rather an investable, productive asset which provides financial capital and a source of wealth for governments and its citizens. So this is about creating a new source of wealth for the government. Working areas. So the working areas are going to primarily be lands like private lands that have conservation easements in perpetuity on them. And if you're familiar with the conservation easements, when the landowner sells that conservation easement to the land trust or a government entity, they are basically selling the development rights. And they are also selling control of that property, which is one of the reasons we say, landowners can put a conservation easement on their land just to understand that it's no longer private property, because the fundamental element of ownership is you control that property, and you give that away when you put the conservation easement on. But that development right then becomes an asset that is listed on the Land Trust balance sheet. So you can pull up the Nature Conservancy's balance sheet, pull up their 990s, the nonprofit report, and they have a balance sheet, and they have a figure in there. I'm trying to remember if I think it's about $2.5 billion on the last one that I looked at, just in a line item of ownership of conservation easements worldwide. Okay, that's a separate asset. So that asset can be enrolled as an asset in the natural asset company, with or without the landowner's consent. Now, the land trusts are going to make out really good in the natural asset companies, because not only do they get to list those conservation easements and gain a profit, a return back for listing them, but remember when I said that the purpose of these natural asset companies is to protect the lands? Well, who's going to protect them? Well, those are your land trusts, your biologists, your attorneys, the land trusts that provide those ecosystem services to protect the land. So the environmental groups are going to be able to double dip. They get to place the conservation easement as an asset and get paid that way, and then they get paid for protecting that same land. It's really, I mean, I don't think we're going to find any land trusts opposing this concept. So it says, and this is one thing I thought was really interesting and worth noting, is under working areas it says, yet producing these essential goods and services and managing resources wisely is as valuable, or perhaps even more valuable, than food production. So they're not concerned about, are we going to be able to feed the nation? And if you really, follow the people behind this, then one of the things you'll find is common among them is they also believe in population control, that there are too many of us. So that's one of the reasons why, we're probably looking at this language thinking, who would say that, right? Because we value life. But they have a different perspective. And part of that is that they do believe there's too many of us. And so population control is not really a big concern to them. And then the third area is the hybrid areas. So this is going to be a combination of protected areas plus working lands. And basically the example they give are what are called conservation areas. So they could connect conservation areas with wildlife corridors to support biodiversity, ecosystem resilience, and recreation. Agriculture lands within the perimeter of the protected areas could be included to convert farm practice to regenerative methods. And then, of course, the example they give is the conservation areas. And I just want to point this out. These are being created right now by the Biden administration all over the nation in a way that we have not seen them do before. So this is one that they are doing right now in Montana. The red circle is the area that they're creating as a conservation area. What they're using is they're taking a national wildlife refuge. And then when Congress creates the National Wildlife Refuge, they also create a buffer zone around it where acquisitions can be made within that buffer zone to expand the National Wildlife Refuge. So this one is at the very bottom. It's kind of in blue. I don't know if you can see it up there, but it's only 50,000 acres. The buffer zone that Congress created is another 150,000 acres. But the new conservation area that they are creating in order to acquire more conservation easements in these lands within this area is 5.8 million acres. That's their new buffer zone that they are doing administratively. Included in this is 500,000 acres of state land, and the state did not even know they were doing this. So U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service partnered with the Nature Conservancy and the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, I think is the name of those two groups, came up with this plan, came up with the map and the area that they would now be placing in a conservation area, and then determined they would, within this area, they want to acquire 250,000 acres in conservation easements, which tells me they know exactly which lands they want to put those easements on. There's over 2 million acres of private land in this. And so now everybody inside this circle, I think the best explanation of how this is going to work is Roman Balmakoff of Facts Matters, who did the No Farmers, No Food film. He said, it's like an anaconda snake. They get you circled, and then they just start squeezing. And I think that's exactly what we're going to see here. One of these is being created, a big one in Florida now. And I think we're going to see them pop up all over. This is something for you guys to be very aware of because they're doing it administratively, and all they need is a national wildlife refuge. And I'm sure you have plenty here in the state. So just heads up, this is something, when you start hearing these kind of things happening, you can connect the dots, and it's certainly something pushing back on. We actually think that eventually it's probably going to be named a national monument by Biden because the dark green to the right is Yellowstone National Park. And up at the top is Crown of the Continent, and then to the left is the Idaho Wilderness Area. So it would be nothing for them to for Biden to create another huge national park and see what he can get away with. All right, so what lands can be listed in the NACs? National parks, national wildlife refuges, wilderness areas, ACECs, conservation areas, conservation easements on private lands, and private lands. Private landowners can enroll their land in this. What meets the definition, which we have a question on, whether or not they could be included, endangered species critical habitat. It actually meets the definition. And conservation reserve program. So those are the lands that landowners, the government will pay landowners to set aside their land and not use it for a period of time, 10 years now up to 30 years they're doing. That's another one. And in fact, Senator Ricketts is circulating a letter that will be sent to SEC that he's getting other senators to sign right now. And one of his questions in there is, will CRP lands be included, considered as something that can be added as the asset? I think it's a really good question. So will this scheme work? Well, as I already told you, our perspective is no. And as I studied this since September of 2021, and I kept scratching my head, this isn't going to work. How's it going to work? What I finally had to recognize is that's not the goal. So, the issue is never the issue. That's really what I think is going on here. No, it's not going to work. This is not an investment company that's going to make. But that's not the purpose for it. They just need it to work long enough to acquire the rights to the natural resources so that eventually, as they squeeze all the private landowners off or get them to comply and join in the natural asset company, then they will own the resources and they can develop it. And the reason I think that, and I think it bears out in this rule, is because there's only one penalty in here if the natural asset company does not sustainably manage these lands. And that is they get delisted. So now they're not under the restrictions of the natural asset company. And if they, in that time frame, have managed to acquire all those rights, now they can go mine, drill, whatever they want on that land. The only penalty is they get delisted. So I think that, from my perspective, and of course it's just my opinion, but that's the conclusion that I've landed on. Whitney Webb, the one who first reported on this that we picked up, was thus, she says this I think very well, thus asset management firms that essentially already own much of the world, like BlackRock, could thus become owners of soon-to-be monetized natural processes, natural resources, and the very foundation of nature, life itself, or natural life itself. I think that's a pretty good concluding statement. So, now that I've thoroughly ruined your day with all this great new information, I take any questions.
Do we have any questions?
Would you entertain a question from the chair? I actually have two. One is coming from the Honorable House of Representatives, who is sitting in the corner over there. The question is, when you have private business or private landowners, that are leasing their minerals, just as an example, to a private entity to harvest those minerals, does a NAC have the ability to come in and tell a private business owner that they're going to benefit from those mineral rights, or would the landowner still have a contract with a private entity?
Yeah, so since one of the things that is prohibited in a NAC is actually mining, or in oil and gas, and it's very specific that those are, they say anything that, no activities can happen that aren't replenishable. So immediately it eliminates those. But I actually think that the purpose of the NAC is to acquire the rights, not necessarily to develop them, but to develop them later when they're no longer in the NAC. So I don't know exactly how they're going to go about acquiring those rights, because there'll be different legal issues involved, but there's nothing that I've seen that would prohibit the minerals from being enrolled in the NAC. As long as they can get them listed in the NAC, they can be listed.
Thank you. And follow-up question is, what other nations, you mentioned that there were NACs in other countries or other nations. Can you tell us which of those NACs are in which nations?
I think when they made their announcement in September of 2021, they featured, I believe it was the Minister of Costa Rica, who had a really good statement of how wonderful these things are and how it's really helping their country. And so that is one place where I believe it's Costa Rica, and I can go back and confirm that in that original material. But the other thing that we have seen happen, though, is, and it's not the only places this has been done, where I think they've really been doing this is primarily in the third world countries, where you have debt-ridden nations that are trying somehow to get money in, and so they give away their rights, their natural rights, natural asset rights, put them in these companies, and then that's where the profit is coming from. We did see a story come out, and I can't remember which country it was from, but where the country was actually having to bail out the NAC because it wasn't making an investment return. So we're already seeing examples of how it's not going to work. But there's a couple articles out there, and I can get you more information on that. Okay.
Any other questions? If you're done, we'll move on.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing. And our next speaker is Trent Loos. He's a radio host and sixth-generation farmer and rancher. Trent, you're recognized.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. And I'm just going to start off by saying that I don't disagree with anything Margaret said, except one slight tense. This is not something that's going to happen. It has happened, is happening, and turns out Oklahoma's in the lead and happening now. I'll walk through all of that. But I find it interesting my hotel was selected for me, which I asked to happen. It's not like the control was taken away from me. It was my choice. I said, please pick me a hotel, and it was downtown. And I arrived at 9:30 last night, exact same time that the Oklahoma Thunder got done playing. And at first I was like, why do I have to deal with all these people walking out of this Paycom center across the street? I'm going to hit somebody. And then I went to my room and I put together an entire radio program about the average attendance at the Oklahoma Thunder for the last 5 years. Does anybody here know what it was? Average attendance per game. Over 18,000. How does Oklahoma Thunder improve our lives? It doesn't. It's a luxury. Last week, I was on a tour. I organized a tour. I called it Across the Pond, Regaining Control for the Farmer Tour. We traveled 7 days in a row, starting in Quincy, Illinois. Then we went to Wisconsin and Minnesota, South Dakota, North Dakota, Nebraska, and then Colorado. And I had a friend, two friends actually, from the UK. I do a TV show every morning with Andrew Henderson from the United Kingdom. And we talk about this issue that we're here today talking about. And we talk about the Netherlands, where a third of the farmers are told they're going to sell their property and can never get back in agriculture, and the European Union. We talk about the Ireland dairymen that are told they're going to get rid of 200,000 dairy cows in Ireland, a nation that prides itself in producing high-quality milk. And we were really happy last week with our tour, Casey, when we would have 100 people in the audience. And Michael can attest to this. When you put a meeting on out in the country, you get 100 people there, you think, we did good. 100 people came on average to a meeting where we're talking about ensuring a domestic supply of food and fuel for our future. I can take you back to April of 2021, 3 months after, 3 months after January 27th, 2021, when Joe Biden signed Executive Order 18004. I organized a meeting in Payne County, Oklahoma. We had about 60 people show up wanting to know about this 30 by 30 deal. And here's the thing. How many, I would just like to see, by show of hands, without embarrassing anybody, how many have read the 57 pages of Executive Order 18004? Would I be the only one? Because it's very troubling if you read the whole thing. It talks about the climate crisis we're in. And Margaret walked through Section 216 very well. But there's 56 other pages. And the 56 other pages say that fossil fuels are a problem. We got to get rid of it. So let's bring this all back just to the ground level. Fossil fuel is the problem because it emits greenhouse gases, correct? Oklahoma, one of the richest fossil fuel petroleum states in our nation. And I say thank you for that. And we can't abandon that. But the greenhouse gases are causing a climate crisis. That's the name of Executive Order 18004. What are the greenhouse gases? Nitrous oxide. 78% of the Earth's atmosphere is nitrous oxide. And why did God put nitrous oxide in the atmosphere at 78%? Because it actually converts into nitrogen, which improves the health of the planet. We have methane as a greenhouse gas. What's methane do? What did God put methane in the atmosphere? Well, you can take methane, which, by the way, Oklahoma today is the second leading source of electricity is from natural gas, and 90% of natural gas is methane. And we can produce electricity with methane, or we can take methane, natural gas, and convert it into synthetic nitrogen, plant food, which improves the planet. Then you have sulfur oxide. I got a great story. I'm glad Margaret shared that story that happened with those public hearings last week at the headwaters of the Missouri River, because there was a train derailment at the Yellowstone River in June. And my wedding anniversary of 30 years was in June, and I talked my wife into going to Montana for our kind of like our second honeymoon, so to speak. I failed to mention that there was a EPA public meeting about sulfur oxide in the Yellowstone River because of 17 cars that derailed in the Yellowstone River. She enjoyed the public hearing, I think, because we were there the whole time, all right? We were there like 3 days. But I go to this public hearing, and there's molten sulfur that is in one of these train cars that's in the Yellowstone River. And there are people there downstream that want to know, Columbus, Montana, the first place that's their source of water, Yellowstone River. And they're all like, are we going to be contaminated? What's going on? And the spokesperson for the EPA said, we happen to have a biochemist here. John, would you please explain why there's no risk with this molten sulfur of contaminating the people who are drinking the water where the molten sulfur's in? And he walks through it and he says, in no way, shape, or form can you get enough sulfur from this in the water that's going to be a problem. You have nothing to worry about. So they didn't create a great opportunity for public comment. But afterwards, I went over to him and I said, walk me through this, how the sulfur in the water is not going to be a problem for the people drinking the water. And he explained it and it all made sense, and I believe him. I said, then why did the EPA ban sulfur in diesel fuel in 2003, creating less sulfur oxide in the atmosphere and consequently forcing farmers to now put between 15 and 17 pounds of sulfur per acre in their fertilizer when they didn't ever have to before you banned it? And he started walking me down this path. He said, well, it's about the acid rain. And when you get sulfur in the atmosphere and then it rains through it, it brings back these toxins. I said, whoa, 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 whoa. You just told a group of 200 people that sulfur in the water was not a problem, but if it rains through the sulfur, it's going to pose a health risk? You know what his answer to me was? Well, I'm from the East Coast, and you guys out here just think differently than I do. Yeah, we think in science. And then we have one other greenhouse gas that's the real problem of the day. Carbon dioxide, CO2, in the Earth's atmosphere at 430 parts per million. Oh my goodness, this is causing climate change like we've never seen before. We got to get a wind turbine. We got to get a solar panel. We got to shut down natural gas. We got to shut down fracking. We got to shut down all these things because CO2 is killing everybody, except every kid in the dorm room growing marijuana has a CO2 machine that has the marijuana at 600 parts per million. All four of the greenhouse gases that we're trying to mitigate through 14008 are responsible for plant growth and a healthy planet. So what's really happening? Everything Margaret walked through is exactly what's happening. They have found a way to control the land of the United States without buying it at all. They write an easement. They sell you this package where you get paid to put wind turbines on your place. By the way, Oklahoma leads in wind turbines. 46% of Southwest Power Pool electricity comes from wind turbines. Anybody keeping track of what's going on that supplies Margaret's power in Texas with ERCOT? ERCOT's desperate. In their last monthly meeting, which was 2 weeks ago, they're begging coal-fired power plants to come back online. This would be a nice time to show that, if that works okay. Thank you for doing that. I just found this morning. This is the Southwest Power Pool from North Dakota. Actually, most of North Dakota is on MISO. But you see, what do you see in that graph? The green is actually less, it's the price of electricity. And North Dakota should be more green than that. Is that the one I sent to you? Okay. But look at Oklahoma. See how it's coloring and getting to where it's costing more and there's more dark and red in Oklahoma? That's not the graph that I had this morning. Consequently, my point is that your cost of power is increasing extensively. 21% of the electricity in Oklahoma comes from natural gas, 11% comes from coal, and 28% comes from wind. Less than 0.5% comes from solar. But 41% is purchased. Why is 41% of the electricity in Oklahoma purchased? Who's it purchased from? I didn't take the time or couldn't find where it's purchased from in this particular graph, but it's quite troubling me. And my point is this. You look at the wind turbine situation, and I know you came to talk about 30 by 30, but this is all part of the mix. Because I was in a coal-fired power plant last week in Beulah, North Dakota, and 3 days a week on average, that coal mine cannot supply coal into the coal-fired power plant. They are forced by the government to take electricity from wind or solar when it's available, and the coal plant doesn't pay, Basin Electric doesn't pay a dime for it. The government 100% offsets the cost of electricity from wind and solar. Meanwhile, the coal plant's sitting there idle, without anything to sell. Why is that significant? Because you have wind turbines, they're sold. NextEra will come and tell you that the life expectancy of the wind turbine is 15 to 20 years. Problem is that at the 10-year mark, they lose their subsidy, and you have to get a new wind turbine. Anybody been to Sweetwater, Texas in the last couple of weeks, last couple of months? They're stacking wind turbines like you can't believe in a graveyard. There are wind turbines that are decommissioned from Oregon going to Louisiana, Missouri. I was at the gravel quarry, Wayne B. Smith gravel quarry last week, where they got 40 acres and they don't know what to do with them. And they have to replace them because there's a subsidy coming from the Inflation Reduction Act to make sure you continue to modify these or upgrade them, because you're not going to continue to get a subsidy. It's 100% subsidy driven. Look at what's happening in Enid. You got this massive proposed solar development center right by an airport that's vital for security. Go out into where Margaret grew up in the central part of Nevada. They're putting up wind and solar. And they're talking about the ranchers can't take care of the land, but they're transferring it over to something that is not environmentally beneficial either with what's happening in that land. I talked to last week a guy, and I could get you the interview with a guy who put up wind turbines for 12 years. He quit, and now he's an advocate against it because he talks about what's happening to the habitat in the area. But here's the moral of the story. We can talk all day and night about where energy supplies come from. What does everybody who gets a wind turbine, a solar panel, or a CO2 pipeline going through their property do? They sign an easement that just give away their right to their property to somebody else that's going to end up traded on that New York Stock Exchange right there. We're losing our ability to take care of our own land. It's been happening. And unlike the other countries, here's where they really got smart with this whole project. And if you read Executive Order 18004 from start to finish, it'll all make sense. They're not coming in and saying, you're going to sign this. They create a hardship in taking care of land and food and producing food so that every family says, man, look at the cost of these inputs. If they're offering this, I have a friend, I'm not going to name the friend because most of you here know somebody in that family, and they're in Oklahoma, and they're continually telling me, well, it's my land, Trent. I can do what I want to with your land. You can, except this is being funded by me and you. It's different with property rights when they're using 100% subsidy money to do this. The CO2 pipeline, which at this moment we've got held at bay in Illinois, Minnesota, Iowa, South Dakota, North Dakota, and Nebraska, because this has been my main thrust for the last 6 months. $17 billion in subsidies is proposed for this CO2 pipeline project. But here's the kicker again. I sign a CO2 pipeline easement, I pay the tax on the land. I pay the mortgage at the bank. And I can't plant a tree without contacting whoever owns my easement to say, is this okay? They found the most clever way ever to control the biggest chunk of 647 million acres, which we call the United States of America, where they already own 33% of it, as Margaret walked you through, have another 12% that's in a conservation easement, and now they want to take, thanks to 30 by 30 and Executive Order 18004, control of another 30% of that, at least, which we know is more than that by 2050. We have people who are getting this little carrot dangled in front of them, and it didn't just start now. It started in 1972 with a guy named Maurice Strong, who was working for the United Nations. In 1972, what else was created? Endangered Species Act, the biggest colossal disaster the federal government's ever created. 2,600 plants and animals have been listed, and they take credit for saving 71, which 24 of those never even existed in the United States to begin with. This is a land grab like we've never seen before. And the problem is that we have people who are signing up because they think they have to take this money to keep up with their neighbor. We're creating it. I parallel it to, I become a very good student of the Bolshevik Revolution, because what's interesting is in the Bolshevik Revolution, they voted to go into servitude. We're allowing our people to vote to go into servitude with the dangle of a carrot. ERCOT is telling us we will not make it through this winter without electricity on a regular basis. And when that happened on the third week of February in 2022, we were 4 minutes from a complete shutdown. Here's the bad news. So I don't mean to be redundant, but Oklahoma gets a Public Service Commission of Oklahoma for the power, which is part of the Southwest Power Pool. There were 4 days in September where Southwest Power Pool had demand of 5 megawatts of electricity higher than the supply. And I regret that they found a way to keep the electricity running. Because if we just had 2 days with no electricity in September, we'd wake people up. I can bring you Mike Nazi, who testified in front of the Texas Assembly and said, if you go more than 20% wind and solar as your electric supply, you're vulnerable and you will have power outages. Texas's ERCOT is at 38% today. We in the Southwest Power Pool get 46%. And 100% of it comes from an easement that is not going to be in our favor. So there's a lot of rabbit holes that you didn't expect there. One other thing that I might add, do you know what nation has led the United States in the last 5 years in earthquakes? What state? Oklahoma. Y'all been doing a 50s, 60s rock and roll down here for the last 5 years. And the U.S. Geological Service says it's not because of the fracking from the oil, it's because injecting fluids back into Earth causes geological challenges, and that leads to everything that we're talking about. And what we want to do now is inject CO2 in Earth, even though Cornell University says that they've now figured out that all volcanoes are a result of CO2 coming through the Earth's crust, mixing with hydrogen to create a volcano. That shouldn't be news to anybody. We have 3 plants in the United States that are U.S. Air Force is flying jets today with fuel that's derived from CO2 mixed with hydrogen, because when you mix hydrogen and CO2 together, you get an explosion. And yet they're telling us we need to take the CO2 in the name of climate crisis and bury it in the ground 1.5 miles deep. These are the things I'm working on, and this is 100% tied back to this executive order, which I think we all need to just let everybody know that the future of this country is tied to the ownership of land and not succumbing our right to our property as somebody in the New York Stock Exchange, or better yet, at Davos. I will also tell you that the first state that my phone rang from and said, Trent, we got a problem here in Oklahoma because we have Chinese nationals showing up, buying land, and paying cash. I talked to a guy in Payne County that bought a cash counting machine because they was selling so much land and they were coming in paying for it in cash, and then you all know what they did next. They put a marijuana grow house on there and took it out of the agricultural sector and put it into commercial. These are issues that just need to be addressed, and I will be in any way, shape, or form with you to bring awareness to the challenges that we've laid out in front of you. You thought you scared them to death, Margaret. I'd love some questions.
Are there any questions? I have a few statements, and I appreciate you all coming and testifying, and I know the people listening and some of the members in here they've got some questions in their minds. And when I put this together, this study, I'm thinking, which direction where do I start? And this is such a big issue, not just for the United States, but around the world on what's going on. I'm like, I don't know where to start. Where do I start this meeting? Where do I start this study? How do I address what is going on without sounding like a crazy, end of the world nut job? Because this is happening, and there's little signs around. I don't know how many people watched the debates and the presidential debates, and Sean Hannity interviewed Gavin Newsom. And in that interview, Gavin Newsom made the comment, offhanded, that California was going to take back 30% of its land for wildlife, which ties right into what this 30-30 plan is. Tie it back down to just the California. They're not taking 30% of Orange County. They're not taking 30% of San Francisco. They're going inland. Now let's scroll out to the United States. They're not looking at taking 30% of the East Coast and protecting it. They're looking at Middle America. What can Oklahoma do? I've been looking, what can we do? There are little things that Oklahoma does. You know, we are the United States of America. We're not just America. We are the United States of America. We have states' rights. America is put together by 50 independent states that govern themselves. We have options here, but they are looking at Middle America, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado, Wyoming. I'm glad you put that map up there. I don't know if I'm that good at geography, but they're looking right at us.
I did figure out, sorry to interrupt you, that's a live map that's showing you the reason that it changed is because now we have sunlight and we have windmills running. So that map is showing you exactly what's happened at the time. And it's interesting that during the night hours when there was no sun, probably no wind, it was completely different than it is now. I wanted to add one other thing because you made me think of it that I forgot with Gavin Newsom. In the 1920s, farmers in the Klamath River Basin in Oregon and Northern California spent millions of dollars to build 4 dams in the Klamath River Basin to do 2 things: produce hydroelectricity and irrigation for crops. The United States government has now blown out the first one of those, and they're going to blow them all out at a $250 million cost because they want the river to return to its natural state.
We have, as far as our duties as state senators and state representatives, our duties to our constituents, our people in Oklahoma. And this is an attack on their way of life. Whether you are a representative or senator in Oklahoma City, this 18,000 people that came to the Thunder game last night, I would just guess that half of them came from Weatherford, Oklahoma. Well, from outside of Oklahoma City. They came from Weatherford, Oklahoma. They came from Guyman, Oklahoma. They came from Enid. They came from Muskogee. Oklahoma City's economy is driven by all of Oklahoma. And those people, their livelihoods is in rural Oklahoma. I'll bet you there was a few from Duncan there, wasn't there, Madam Chairman?
Folks in Stevens County can't get out of the county, I don't think.
It could be. But if this plan goes through, it's going to affect the livelihood of every Oklahoman. It doesn't matter whether you live in Felt, Oklahoma, or you live in Tulsa, or you live in Oklahoma City. This plan will affect every Oklahoman that we have in this state. And I wanted to do this study to, at first, give the members a 30,000-foot view of what's going on, an introduction of what's going on, open our eyes, this is coming. And after I went to the summit, I picked up right away when Gavin Newsom said 30%. It all ties together. You look at the rhetoric coming out of Washington, D.C., they're more bold in what they're saying as far as attacks on agriculture or their attacks on the climate change. They're more bold in what they're wanting to do. We have to stand up for our people. We have to do everything we can do to make sure Oklahomans can continue to live the way they want to live. And with that, I will close. I really appreciate. Yes, Margaret.
One thing I left out that I really wanted to touch on, I kind of hate all this food and batteries.
Push your button.
One of the things I wanted to touch on that I left out, because I always hate bringing the bad news, but there are solutions, and there are things that the state can do, and I appreciate that that's what you're looking at. And one of the recommendations, and this just comes from studying the material and what they're doing and what we perceive they're going to be doing in the future, the state can limit how much conservation land is in the state. Like you said, you have that authority. You're an independent state. And we have talked about this at the national level and all the way down to the county level and have received a very, very good response. We are recommending that you set a limit in each county at the county level of how many lands can go into the conservation status. So how many acres within the county can be held in federal ownership, conservation reserve, conservation easements, foreign ownership, all of those devices, and there's more that you all can talk about, and as you know your state's property better than I would, but all those devices devalue the property. So we know in Nebraska, Department of Revenue did a study, and they found that the Wetland Reserve Program, which is a conservation easement program initiated or run by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, devalues the land by 40%. We know when land goes into the Conservation Reserve Program, it's no longer in production. So that hurts the local economy because you're not now getting products off of that and jobs off of that. And so these are all things, all those devices that devalue the land, which are all those devices they are using to protect the land and get control of the assets. You put a limit in on how many of those devices can be in a county. And we have recommended anywhere from, well, I was in New Mexico last week. We've been talking about a 15% limitation. No more than 15% can be in. And when I was with the New Mexico counties last week, they said, for us, it would be 10%. Having 10% of their land locked up where they don't get that economic value from already harms their economy. So I think that's something that really is, the reason we like that idea is because you're actually getting in front of the problem. You know, for some of the states in the West where they're already 97% federally owned, it's not going to be very helpful for them. But for you in this state, it could be very helpful. You guys set the limit. You guys determine how much of the land in the state of Oklahoma is going to be conserved and exposed to these kind of devices that, like the natural asset companies. That would be our recommendation.
I'd like to finish up with one last story. So I spent 10 years of my life working for New Mexico State University. I ran a research facility for them. And in 2001, the federal government bought 101,000 acres north of Santa Fe, New Mexico. Congress made a special deal on this. This was when they allocated the $101 million to buy this ranch. It was supposed to be, they set it up in a trust. They did not give it to the Forest Service. They didn't give it to Parks or BLM. They set it up in its own trust to be preserved as a working cattle ranch. Today, there's not one cow on this place. Change the administration, change the board of this trust, and now it is strictly for walking trails and tours and that sort of thing. But what happens when we have another administration change or a trust change and they decide, well, this just needs to be strictly wildlife. No humans can come. And they restrict access totally to the public. Once the federal government takes the deed, takes ownership, the people lose all control over that land. It happens. I saw it personally. And this is something that we have to be very, very aware of what's going on. And with that, I thank you all. Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you all for coming and speaking.
Thank you so much for hosting us today. Thank you for everyone who attended, and I will go ahead and adjourn this meeting.